Okay, welcome everyone to the, what may be the last installment of the Activist Studio, a series of public conversations on art, politics, and human rights. Styron sends her regrets. She is in Washington, D.C. tonight, filming some event with a bunch of other folks. So it is me. She's left me in the house alone with these two extraordinary folks, and who I'll introduce in a minute. As you know, we've had 5 of these events so far. This is the 6th, and tonight's occasion is in conjunction with a conference we're having here at the Kennedy School of Gay Rights is Human Rights. The theme of the conference this year is Building Coalitions, Changing Culture. We had a great session yesterday on queering development practices, and this is part of and we have a whole bunch of stuff tomorrow that I'll announce at the end of today's session. This is also, I should say, part of a week-long, the first ever university-wide week of LGBT programming at Harvard. And this was the brainchild of Sam Lee, who is the co-chair of the Kennedy School LGBT Caucus. This has been an extraordinary week of events at almost all of the graduate schools in the college, and again, also here at the Kennedy School. So I'm really thrilled to have this be a part of it. Tonight we're going to talk about queering human rights is the title of the session. And I'm going to ask our guests a whole range of questions. This is one of those remarkable opportunities for me to sit with 2 friends and comrades who I love. And so this is going to be much less formal than some of these events have been. It's really going to be a conversation, and hopefully a very lively, radical conversation with 2 friends and colleagues. Let me just introduce Sarah Schulman and Helen Molesworth. Sarah on my right and Helen on my left briefly, and then we'll just launch into a discussion. Sarah Schulman is an award-winning novelist and playwright, an outspoken activist for social justice, born and raised in New York City. She's currently professor of English at CUNY, Staten Island. She is also a fellow at the New York Institute for the Humanities at New York University. She's the author of 9 novels, most recently The Mere Future, published in 2009. Many of these novels have been translated into other languages. Her nonfiction books include The Gentrification of the Mind, Witness to a Lost Imagination, which is published this year, Ties That Bind, Familial Homophobia and Its Consequences, which is a remarkable book that I just sent to my parents. Love my parents, but they will benefit from reading this. Stage Struck, Theater, AIDS, and the Marketing of Gay America, and My American History, Lesbian and Gay Life During the Reagan-Bush Years. And oh, the years they were. During the 1980s and 1990s, Sarah was active in the downtown arts movement, and since 2002 has been presenting her plays in mainstream theaters in New York and regionally. As an activist, she has worked for the Committee for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization Abuse, Irish Lesbian and Gay Organization, and ACT UP. She is the co-founder of Lesbian Avengers, and with Jim Hubbard of The Mix, Lesbian and Gay Experimental Film Festival. She and Jim Hubbard also serve as co-directors of the ACT UP Oral History Project. Sarah's awards include a Guggenheim in Playwriting, a Fulbright for Judaic Studies, a Rghts Fellowship from Columbia University, the Stonewall Award for contributions improving the lives of lesbians and gays in the United States, 3 New York Foundation of the Arts Fellowships, 2 American Library Association Book Awards, the Pharaoh Grumley Award in Lesbian Fiction, and the Kessler Prize for Sustained Contribution to LGBT Studies. Award-winning hardly begins to describe. And speaking of which, Helen Molesworth is a distinguished, I'm giving you an award tonight. The Tim McCarthy Award for Fierce, Fabulous, Friendly Friendship. I love alliteration, so you're both get plaques for that later on. I'll give her first because she wants an award. It's all right. Helen Molesworth is a distinguished scholar, writer, and curator. She is the newly appointed chief curator of the Institute for Contemporary Art in Boston. Previously, she was the Houghton Curator for Contemporary Art at Harvard University Art Museums, where she headed the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art. While at Harvard, Molesworth organized a number of stunning exhibitions, including Long Life, Cool White, photographs by Moira Davey, and then this fall's extraordinary ACT UP New York exhibition, Activism, Art, and the AIDS Crisis, 1987 to 1993. As guest curator of Harvard University's Carpenter Center for the Arts, she organized Corbu Pops, an installation by William Pope L., Paul Chan, 3 Easy Pieces, and Felix Gonzalez Torres, Untitled, Placebo, Landscape for Ronnie, among other exhibitions. Before relocating to Boston, Molesworth was chief curator of exhibitions at the Wexler Center for the Arts in Columbus, Ohio, overseeing the center's exhibitions, programs, and publications. There, she co-curated the first United States retrospective of Luc Tuymans, as well as the critically acclaimed Part Object, Part Sculpture. She also served as curator of contemporary art at the Boston Museum of Art from 2000 to 2002, where she organized the show Work Ethic. From 1997 to 99, she was director and curator of the Emily A. Wallace Gallery at the State University of New York at Old Westbury. And she served as senior critic at the Yale School of Art and has been taught at Bard Center for Curatorial Studies at SUNY Old Westbury and the Cooper Union School of Art in New York. She was a co-founding editor of Documents, a magazine of contemporary visual culture, and is the author of numerous articles appearing in such publications as Art Journal, Art Forum, Documents in October. She received her PhD in history and the history of art at Cornell University in 1997. I should also say that Helen and Sarah were named to Out Magazine's top 100 people of the year. I was the 101st. But I don't. But evidently I wasn't out enough last year, and so I will. I have to. I'm hoping tonight's going to help.
Everybody now knows.
All right. Everybody now knows it's an aspiration. I wanted to begin tonight with AIDS. As artists and activists, you both worked to document the AIDS crisis in different ways and the activism surrounding the AIDS crisis. Sarah is a member of ACT UP and the co-director of the ACT UP Oral History Project with Jim Hubbard, and Helen in your recent exhibition, ACT UP New York. And let me just put a plug in for my student Martha Wasserman's catalog, which is a senior thesis project that she produced because there were no funds to produce a catalog for the exhibition, and she's done that as a thesis project. To show that to other people. Martha is right here today. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit, each of you, maybe we'll start with Sarah, about what drew you to the work that you've done on AIDS. I know this is a very personal question for both of you, but if we could start there, that would be great.
Well, let's see, the first person I was aware of who had AIDS was, I actually remember this the moment the first thing was that I read the article in the New York Times that many people read, Gay Cancer. I don't know if you're aware of that. And so when I read that, I thought, I guess that was 1981, right?
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, they're going to find out that homosexuality is biological and now produces its own diseases. That was my first thought. At that time, I was a reporter for the New York Native, which was the gay male newspaper in New York City, and I was covering City Hall because in New York we were trying to get a gay rights bill, an anti-discrimination bill. And when AIDS started, I happened to be the City Hall reporter for the gay newspaper. So I covered all of that stuff at the beginning, the closing of the bathhouses, the first arrests of people with AIDS. So I just was thrown into it by accident. I guess I was 23 when that started. And so I've had this opportunity and privilege to have been one of these people who came in on it right at the beginning and is still alive today. So I've followed it all this time. But that's how I was first exposed.
Well, I was in high school. Is this on? You guys can hear me. So I was in high school, and I remember my high school English teacher was gay, and then he got sick. And there was whispering. There was a lot of whispering that he had that gay disease, which was my first exposure to AIDS and what would become the AIDS-HIV crisis. But I think to speak more personally, because we're sort of like a smaller group, and I think we can do that, I started to organize. I'm not an activist in the way that Sarah is. Sarah has genuine activist chops, which I do not. But one of the reasons that I co-organized because I co-organized the ACT UP show at the Carpenter Center last fall with a graduate student named Rghts. One of the reasons that I wanted to organize that show was because my brother-in-law died 3 years ago, not of AIDS-HIV, but was nonetheless a casualty in a profound way of the disease and of the crisis and of what happened to people, those of us who lived through that period. And that conditions in me to do a kind of work that I felt was very necessary. But it's to talk about my own personal investment as well as my more, sort of politically or historically minded motivations around the exhibition.
Yeah, if you could each talk a little bit about the Active Oral History Project on one hand, which seeks to document these stories. And it's such an important archival source, but it's also an important, in many ways, artistic source, a source of stories that have not been told, that are now recorded for posterity, that people can listen to and hear and see. And then Helen, this exhibition, which is now traveling, which is now going, it has been picked up by another museum. And so if you could each talk a little bit about the way in which you sought to represent AIDS, people with AIDS, the crisis itself, and the activism around the silences that so often accompanied AIDS. If you could talk a little bit about these two mediums, this art exhibition on the one hand, and a documentary project.
I think that there's a false discourse about AIDS that's out in the culture that is propagated by these kind of commercial art representations like the movie Philadelphia, or really any mainstream representation of AIDS. The story is that there's a person with AIDS who is alone, and there's no gay community, there's no gay movement. Let's look at the movie Philadelphia. There are no gay lawyers. He has to go to a homophobic lawyer, right? Because there's no gay people to turn to. They're all alone, and thankfully, a homophobic person courageously overcomes their prejudices so that they can help the poor, alone, abandoned gay person. That's kind of the story, and in some ways it's even the story of Angels in America, but it's certainly the story of Philadelphia. It's the mainstream AIDS story, which is that gay people are alone, they don't help each other, they're victims, and straight people are so benevolent and wonderful, and they come and rescue us, and that's the story of AIDS. But actually the true story is that a despised group of people with no rights, who have been abandoned by their families and their government, facing a terminal illness, join together and force this country to change against its will, thereby saving each other's lives. Okay, that's the true story. Now, so many people who know that truth are dead. I am alive, so therefore I have a certain responsibility. And the goal, our goal with the Active Oral History Project, is to replace the false story with the true story. So that's what's motivating us.
When Claire and I set out to organize the exhibition, we were very aware that certain artists are taught now in the history of art, and I think this dovetails with something that Sarah just said. They're taught within the history of art that their work is about AIDS or about the loss produced by AIDS. Ross Bleckner, Felix Gonzalez-Torres, David Wojnarowicz. And it's a tale of proper names, which is the story that art history tells, one great artist after another. And if that great artist happens to be dead, all the better for the story, because art history really loves a dead young artist. They're perfect for us. Because we can project wildly onto them, and we don't have to suffer through any weak patches in their work or any complications that might arise as they grow old and get compromised by the forces of the market. So if they die young, at the height of their powers, they can remain in this sort of like pristine conditions. And when we started organizing the exhibition, we were asked repeatedly, would we be including the work by these people or about these people? And we said, no, what we're actually interested in were the collectives that formed around and through ACT UP, that we were interested in precisely the intersection between the kind of visual acumen that artists bring to the table and what happens when that form of the production of knowledge is intersects with direct kind of activism. And so those were our motivations, to try and make sure that those collective histories were not forgotten in the face of art history's all too easy narrativization around the proper name. which then led us, I think, to larger questions about how history is written generally, and how, I think, and this is something you and I have talked about, how in the history of the sort of struggles for liberation of gay people, we tend not to produce single charismatic leaders. We tend to produce group formations that are relatively anonymous. I mean, certainly charismatic figures emerge in all of those formations, and we know this to be true. But we don't tend to produce a series of proper names. And so how does one begin to rethink how you tell history in the absence of those proper names? And so that was definitely one of the impulses around the organization of the exhibition.
All right, so ACT UP is Martin Luther King.
Right. Or Malcolm.
Yeah.
I think ACT UP was a little more Malcolm than it was Martin. Yeah, couldn't make that analogy.
Actually, it's probably more Bayard Rustin than either. If we're going to go there.
Yeah, we're going to go there. Right.
Speaking of names that are not recognized.
Right.
Much as they should be. Okay. One of the other problems, I think, in representing AIDS or talking about that history is that there are, the iconic image of silence equals death, which became a kind of mantra for the movement, for these collectors during the period of crisis where the government was, and I'll name names, the Reagan administration was silent around the disease, right? Walked for 6 years, 6.5 years, while these folks were dying, and these other folks were responding to that silence and that death by becoming visible and radically visible, demanding that they be seen and heard. And it seems to me that one of the things that troubles me now is that there are these other narratives that are emerging. I had an encounter with a friend of mine, someone I like very much, who's an older gay man in his late 50s, who's been HIV positive for 25 years. And when I was putting together a series of panels for the 25th anniversary of the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Caucus anniversary weekend, this person said to me, we said, we need to have a panel on AIDS. We need to have something on AIDS. I looked at the program, there's nothing on AIDS. The 25th anniversary of this conference. And he said to me in a conference call, Tim, we don't need to talk about AIDS anymore. We're post-AIDS. AIDS is an Africa thing now. This is an older, wealthier, white gay man who, HIV positive, who invoked that as a way to silence that narrative or to exclude that story from a commemoration of a period of time that was dominated by the AIDS crisis. And so I think about silences in two ways. I think about the silences of those who survived that period of time, and then the silences of the voices of people who died during that time. You talked about the sort of responsibility you feel to tell those stories, or to make those stories available, to have other people tell them if they're here. And it seems to me that there are still silences around that death.
Well, I mean, we know that Washington, D.C. has a higher infection rate than West Africa today at this very moment.
Right.
And it's primarily heterosexual women of color and gay men of color who are, not exclusively, but they are primarily people who are getting infected at this moment. Because what we've done in the culture now is what we've said that not getting infected is your personal problem. It's your personal responsibility. We're not going to do anything to help you. We're going to continue to incarcerate black men. We're going to continue to tell gay people that their lives don't matter. We're going to do everything we can to undermine you. But in the face of that, if you get infected, it's your fault. So we're in this profound contradiction that's a no-win. And that's why we can't move forward with prevention.
And then there's another silence that
And also-
yeah, go ahead.
Infection rates among white gay men 18 to 35 are on the rise in this city and in San Francisco. Among putatively the educated community that is not supposed to be having an infection, spike, but they are, and it's totally related to crystal meth, which is being made in Western Mass, which is a poverty, drug industry, and it migrates out to Boston and to the Cape, and it's deeply prevalent in San Francisco as well. So it's the silence of post-AIDS is,
But don't you
crazy.
worry? I mean, the narrative that you replaced the mythical narrative with, is one of us coming together collectively to respond to the silences that were created by those people outside of our community, to feed and fuel oppression that was coming from the most powerful institutions in the country. And one of the things that I worry about is that these silences and these sort of mythical narratives of being post-AIDS are actually in some cases coming from within the LGBT community now, right? The ignoring of, of homeless youth, of rising HIV rates among younger white gay men, among people of color, and in this country, and then obviously the global crisis, which is its own incredibly disturbing reality in this world. To think about being post-age is such a privileged thing to articulate as a wealthy American who can afford drugs to make HIV more livable, right? I mean, I'm profoundly concerned about the kinds of silences and mythical narratives that are coming from within this community that was the only thing we could rely on to save ourselves.
Well, gay people are a mess right now. I mean, we're in this kind of, because we don't know who we are, so we're in this kind of AIDS trauma period. And to me, it reminds me of Jews in the U.S. right after World War II, where they assimilated into the very culture that allowed them to be destroyed. And that's where I feel like gay people are at right now. We don't have an identity. We're embracing myths from the 1950s that didn't work for straight people and aren't going to work for us. And we're desperately trying to achieve them. And the trade-off, I'm speaking to one married person, one about to be married person, but the trade-off for gay marriage is that you lose a community-based relationship, which is one of the greatest resources that we have as a community. So this kind of privatization that we've been going through has been very detrimental, and then we cease to identify with each other, which is what you're talking about. Because let me tell you, in ACT UP, there were some very privileged, rich, white, gay men who used their money in a principled way. Because ACT UP achieved more for women with AIDS, and more for IV drug users, and more for homeless people with AIDS than any other configuration in American history. So it's this separation that you're discussing hasn't always been that way.
Right. Well, and I mean, that raises another point about the sort of the politics of the moment, right? I mean, we've thoroughly lost our radicalism. I mean, that's clear, right? I mean, and I don't just turn to you because you're the married person and I'm the
About to be married.
I'm the about to be married person. In a year, what can happen in a year?
I have what I consider to be a deeply radical marriage.
Deeply radical marriage. Well, it's funny because when I announced to my friends after much ambivalence over this that I was actually going to get married, I said I'm really worried about this. And the first thing that Susan Marie, my colleague here, who's another power dyke, and she said to me, I posted on my Facebook wall, an intensely radical medium, said to me, "Don't worry, Tim, you can be married and still be radical. Love, Susie." And I thought, okay. But I mean, I think that we have, in terms of our politics, I think, lost that radicalism. And I'm wondering if there's any, I mean, to engage in, and so now the Human Rights Campaign, right, our national organization, sees as its foremost human rights issue marriage, right? And if human rights is supposed to be a kind of discourse that liberates us and connects us all as human beings with certain sort of rights that we all deserve as human beings, it seems to me that the sort of loss of radicalism takes the potential liberation out of a human rights discourse when the LGBT enter it to argue for marriage. Am I overstating that? How do you have a radical marriage, Helen?
Well, I don't know. I mean, perhaps I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but I do think that clearly there is an enormous decline in perhaps even complete and total loss of radicalism in this country. I mean, that's not a problem that's just affecting queer people. That's pretty system-wide at the moment, right? So, and that speaks to, I think, the larger forces of neoliberalism at work in this country and in Western Europe, and it's been deeply and profoundly effective. I mean, the translation of all of us from citizens into consumers has been effective, thorough, and in many ways, there have been parts of it that have been pleasurable, and then like owning up to the pleasure of that conversion of our identities is, I think, something, that's some personal work everyone will have to do, and language will have to be found for how to narrate that and to discuss one's own psychic investments in that transformation before we can just decide we're not going to partake in it, right? But in terms of marriage, and I mean, Sarah and I disagree on this front, as we both know. For me, the marriage thing came very, very clear around the Terry Schiavo moment, when there was a person, non-sentient, who was being fought over by her parents and her lover.
And her government.
And her government. And I thought to myself, Jesus fuck. If I'm Terry Schiavo, my parents win, which is the perpetual state of infantilization that gay people are always put in. I want to be married because I don't want my parents involved in that moment in my life. And that's like really clear to me. And that's where I'm at with marriage.
Yeah, but that's so reasonable, Helen, but you didn't invoke all the sentimentality and, the little house and the...
Well, I would have had my sentimental house and my little life. I had all of that before I got married, and, I have it now that I am married. But I really do think, and I do say this, I do think marriage is fundamentally about two things. It's about property and it's about death. And it came out of, I do think that the marriage debate comes out of the ACT UP movement, because a lot of people died and a lot of people lost their access to their property. And so I think that there is a continuum. Now, I think whether or not we want to claim that continuum publicly and fight for what it means and expose ourselves to the ongoing effects of the trauma of all of that death, and do we want to actually say, you know what, this storybook narrative that we have about love can be put in some sort of deep parentheses, and we have to have a conversation about marriage that's a different kind of conversation. Yes, I got married because I love my girlfriend, and right now we want to live together forever. But I also got married because we bought a big piece of property, and I don't want my parents involved in any medical decision. And it was available to us in the state of Massachusetts, and we decided to sign up to let them know. Again, because I'm not an activist, I don't go out and fight for marriage rights. But I felt like taking the right given to me, and to be counted. Although I do confess, the day we picked up our marriage license at the Cambridge City Hall, I thought to myself, this is the dumbest fucking thing I have ever done. When the pogrom comes, I basically just listed myself, this is crazy. What gay person goes to the government and says, hi, we live here. When you're ready for us. It was insane.
Well, it's a shift, it's gay identification with the state. It's a very big shift.
Yeah, no, it is. I want to...
But can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
The Pollyanna part of me believes that the more queer people who get married, that we will in fact change the institution of marriage. That's why the right wing is so flipped out. They're
How
flipped
will it change marriage?
because I actually think it puts parity on the table. And I think it is a kind of blowing open of traditional gender roles. And all of a sudden, if you have marriages that begin with a different understanding of what marital parity is, then the institution cannot quite abide the same structure. So one of the really interesting things that's happened in the state of The word spouse is on all legal and all medical forms. So already in that semantic shift, if we believe, right, in everything we know to be true about language and representation, that to work on the signifier is to do some kind of political work, then the shift to spouse is kind of amazing here.
But also, I want to add to this conversation, because as I said, I've been actually long ambivalent about this. And one of the, about getting married, but as much as it's about death and property, and I don't like to think in those terms because I'm afraid of death and I have no property. I actually think about it in
Get
terms
married
of...
anyway, the property's coming.
Right. And I can be someone's property. Like an old 19th century Bobby Italian. And what a big dowry I am, I'll tell you. I'll tell you, if they value me by the square foot, that would be a hell of a claim. But I wonder, it's also about love and hate. And my partner and I he comes from an African-American evangelical Christian family, which denied him any kind of self-love and any prospect of the possibility of actually having a partnership that would be validated by anything that he knew. I come out of a working class Irish and Italian Catholic family, which did exactly the same thing. And he and I have, one of the conversations we had last week was that we are only now able to love each other and think about a life together because we have finally come to love ourselves through our relationship. And that marking that as this thing, marriage, recognized as this building block of civilization or society or what have you, forces people to recognize us as fully human, which could only be possible because of the fact that we finally be able to love ourselves individually and then love each other collectively. And it seems to me that both of us, actually, this relates back to AIDS, both of us were terrified by the fact that if the first time we fucked anyone, we thought we were going to die. And that's what gay men did. Is you got drunk or you took drugs and you fucked each other and then you died. And when you came of age in the 80s, as we did, with the President Reagan and all of the silences that existed and that were perpetuated by our families and the cultures we grew up in and the religious institutions that we were shaped by, that we're still shaped by, that's all you know. And I remember he and I had a very profound conversation early on in our relationship about the fact that we went through a whole period of time where we never had sex sober, which is a form of self-hatred, right? To place yourself at risk and to put yourself into a situation where you're not even coherent when you're doing the thing that should be marked as the thing that is most human about you. And so it seems for me, the marriage is the demand, the radical demand, that everyone else recognize that I am fully human now that I've finally gotten around to recognizing myself as such, to the point where I can love another person that way. We had this conversation last week, so for us it's really about a radical rejection of hatred, societal hatred and self-hatred, and replacing it with love in that kind of Baldwinian sense of the only thing that actually leads to liberation.
But why should people get privileges for being in a couple? Do you want to keep talking about...
No, I don't. I just wanted to sort of add that to it. But I do think, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow night actually at the plenary, about the sort of the why marriage is this thing. And I think it is. It's this thing that we all talk about now, right? Whether or not we agree with it or fully embrace it or whatever. But
why
yeah, go
should we
ahead.
have more privileges and a social role and more approval because you're in a couple?
Oh, see, I you can get rid of all that stuff. It's not that for me. It's not that for me. Because I don't have any property. It's back to the property thing. I don't have any property. Right. So let's move on to this sort of the sort of role of art. We're going to move to art, and not how art represents marriage, but how art is a powerful medium for representing our experiences. Right. Either you work in the theater, you work in museums. These are institutions that you've both written about that actually in many ways exclude the representations of our experiences, and yet you two work in these institutions to seek to push that representation and make that representation visible, and actually to include it in those powerful institutions that often seek to exclude us. And so I want to talk a little bit about how you see the role of art in forging and forcing this representation of our lives.
The problem isn't art. The problem is the gatekeepers. I mean, there's only one Helen Molesworth. There's 99% or, want to retain, dominant cultural privilege and don't want other points of view represented and do everything they can to demean people who are trying to represent it. So, it's a material problem about individuals and their in power and their behavior. That's the obstacle. Do you agree?
Well, I don't agree that 99% of them are bad, because I'm the kinder and gentler version of myself these days. But I do think, to speak to the sort of title of this, the symposium, we are still at a point where no matter how advanced the thinking is among the institutional players, that queer work is seen to speak solely to a queer audience, right? And so there's no, the idea of a kind of universality, quote unquote, which I have a lot of problems with, but like that is, we are not there. And what we have, with American museums, which is, I work in American museums, so I speak about them specifically. I mean, American museums have a kind of, they operate basically on a kind of quota system, and we have to have so many X, Y, and Z, and queer is not even yet part of the quota system in the American museum.
I think, as a practitioner, I believe audiences are far ahead of gatekeepers.
Oh, they are.
And audiences can receive all this representation that the gatekeepers don't let them have.
No, I think that's quite true. Yeah, quite true. No, I think the museum logic is still a quota logic. And it still believes that if you show a black artist, you'll get a black audience, and if you show a gay artist, you'll get a gay audience. I mean, it still believes in a kind of it's like a mimetic relationship between production and reception. It doesn't ever imagine that the audience might be going to the museum to see something that it does not know about and wants to know about, or that it goes to the museum precisely to have a radical engagement with otherness, whatever form that otherness takes, whether it's the radical otherness of like this, on the table. There's a very limited sense of imagination, I think.
Well, that's the problem of the moment, which is that familiarity equals quality.
Right. Or also that it's also the Facebook, iTunes, again, it's this consumer model that the audience is someone who has already selected what they are interested in, and we will give them what they are interested in. We will not, there is no longer an idea like, we've never seen any artwork, or we don't know anything about like Syria, and so we'll do a Syria thing because that'll be interesting because no one knows anything about Syria, right? We only do that which we can assign interest to. So it's like the Amazon model or the iTunes model. You bought Neil Young Crazy Horse, you might like, and they're always right. I do like it. I own it already. And they're always
with Amazon, it always comes up and say, you'll like these books, and I've already bought those
That's
books
right.
somewhere.
They're always right. So it's and that's what museums are basically now trying to do.
But there are moments in history where suddenly that all explodes and expansion of understanding of what it is to be alive becomes something that people crave.
Yes.
And that will happen again in our lifetimes.
Yes, it will.
Yes.
But isn't part of the problem too, and this gets back to my other point about the silences around AIDS and the new ways in which the silences are being created by LGBT folks, isn't part of the problem the gatekeepers are actually changing, right? We had an election last year where the gatekeepers changed a little bit, right? And it was historic, right? And we have a university here that now has a historic president too, right? And the gatekeepers has, this is my thing, but my point is that if the narrative is that we are constantly up against these gatekeepers, and we have a static understanding of who those gatekeepers are, we actually miss the critique that some of those gatekeepers are actually us now.
Yes.
And we're not doing anything to transform
Well,
them.
yes, we are. The three of us are doing a very good
Well,
job.
the three of us.
No, there are people in their 40s and 50s who've been out professionally all their lives, who have fought, who have thick skins, who've risen to positions of authority and now are trying to do something. And, that's absolutely true. It's the first time that that's been the case, that our generation is in charge in certain places.
But then when you speak to, and this gets at the generational issue that I keep sort of talking, we all talked about this, then when you speak to a younger generation of folks who don't even know the sort of histories that we came through, came up through, or that we were told when we were growing up. And I wonder, the future is going to be about them as much as more so than about us, right? Because we're getting older, and we're not going to be gone. And some institutions are going to root us out anyway before our job is done, right? And so it seems to me that there is, how do we instill in a younger generation of activists, or just a younger generation period, we hope may someday inherit?
I think the 20-somethings right now are fantastic. I'm a teacher, right? So, what I hated was the generation right after mine, which were the yuppies. They were just unbearable. But people in their 20s now, they have no economic future. And there's nothing that makes you become an individual and figure out what your own values are more than not having a path laid out in front of you towards money. So I see even with my own students, and I teach only working class and poor students. I don't have wealthy students. I teach in the city university, but even they have to put it together, and they have to have multiple jobs, and they have to juggle and to figure out who they are so they know how to put it together. So, I'm very excited about them. I don't know if it's true at Harvard, but is it? Yeah.
There are pockets. Yeah, there are pockets, no question. But I find actually that the pockets of students that actually are the activists, as opposed to the public servants, as opposed to the folks who are going to go out in the world and volunteer, write a check. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Those are all good things, and we all do those things too. But it seems to me that the students who are genuinely activists, who have a kind of radical or progressive critique, and I hear this in chemistry school all the time, I hear this at the college too, they find each other and create a cohort of criticality. And they're miserable in these institutions often. And I hope I'm not betraying too much here, but they're not happy here in the same ways that their peers are happy, because their peers don't have that kind of consciousness. It seems to me that a larger transformational project has to, if it's going to be done through these institutions, and I don't know, then maybe that's up for grabs. Do people have to come through these institutions that move at glacial paces in terms of progress? Do they have to come through these institutions in order to be able to be authorized to do human rights work or social justice work in the broader ground? Or can they kind of maintain their radicals and find their herd and bypass these institutions?
Well, there's been a class consolidation ever since Reagan was elected in 1980, right? And what's happened in the arts, professionalization of the arts, is just emblematic of a broader problem, that American aristocracy is based on what school you went to. It determines if you're a good person, if you're smart, if your life matters. That's right, that's how it's defined in this country. There was a time when that didn't determine your social value, and we will return to that time. But certainly progressive people who come from ruling class schools, they run the progressive world. They're the ones who are in charge, and you can call each other up. And I see people from Harvard all over the place who are running great institutions. It shouldn't be exclusively that case, that situation, but I'm expecting you all to, Maribel, to be taking that role in the future, because it's the left wing of the ruling left. Isn't it?
The Democratic wing of the ruling class. Right.
I can't talk about that.
No, that's fine. You just left.
You just left.
I really can't. What I do want to say in terms of the younger generation is that I think it's really important that queer people not make the same mistake that sort of second generation feminists make, which is to insist upon our trauma and our passage through the difficult time and how easy it is for young people now. I think that just has to be shelved. Mazel tov that you don't have the trauma.
Actually,
Great.
it's harder for them on some level because they're being told that things are so great.
Yeah.
We were being told that we were horrible and our lives are going to be hell, and they're being told that they're tolerated and accepted and everything's fine.
And their peers actually really like that.
Yeah, but, I don't know. I don't think that's so bad. I actually think it's really I'm endlessly fascinated by the gay children of my friends who are being raised by parents who know they are gay and are okay with it. And I don't know, I do think a different subjectivity will emerge around gay identity, because they're not moving through. I mean, sure, they're gonna hit shame and some other fucked up stuff when they get to school, or at some point the culture will let them know of their second-class status, but their parents haven't let them know that. And that's going to produce something different that will be really very, very interesting. And it will be different. And the thing is then will our version of queerness may not be recognizable. We may not recognize each other's version of queerness, and that might, like, the thing is how to hold on to that being, like, okay, sounds so anodyne, but like that being actually productive, a misrecognition of one another, like how to hold on to that, as opposed to a demand for conformity, intergenerational conformity.
One of the things about, seems to me, much of the work that the two of you have done, whether in the realm of writing, playwriting, in the realm of artistic expression and so forth, has been involved in a project of trying to make all sorts of experiences human, right? Seem human, rendered as human, represented as fully human. And I'm wondering if, and every time I talk about LGBT stuff within the context of human rights, or often when I talk about the LGBT movement within a larger human rights project, people push back and say it's not human rights. And yet, the largest national organization is called the Human Rights Campaign, with no sense of irony, of course, with the work that they do. But it seems, is a human rights discourse a useful one for the LGBT community? Or is it something that we're really sort of forcing a graft onto in order to be relevant in a kind of global human rights project? And is this something that we can wrestle with? Does the Human Rights Project change when we enter it? Is it incompatible with the lives that we live and the experiences we have in politics that we articulate?
Well, let me share my recent experience.
Yes, this is a segue into your trip to Palestine.
I was invited to give a keynote address at the Lesbian and Gay Studies Conference in Tel Aviv at Tel Aviv University. And I decided to decline and observe the boycott. So instead of going to Tel Aviv University, I did a solidarity visit, because I didn't want to just sit home either. And I made this decision inspired by the leadership of Judith Butler, who's very much involved in boycott at this time. So I went I gave talk in an alternative venue in Tel Aviv, it was interesting because they say when you boycott, you're cutting the dialogue. There's no communication, but it's not true, because I had 60 people at my talk, and it was in an anarchist queer vegan cafe in Tel Aviv, including people who are part of this movement called Boycott Me, which is Israelis who want people to support the boycott and who are asking people to support the boycott. Then I also got to go to the West Bank and to Ramallah, and I met with queers in Ramallah. There's an organization called El Kaus, which is a gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender organization. It has 4 chapters, 3 in Israel and 1 in Ramallah. And it was really interesting. I had 2 meetings with them, one with the Political Leadership Council and one with the sort of rank and file. And in contrast with in Israel, if you are queer and anti-occupation, you're a very marginalized person. In Palestine, if you're queer and anti-occupation, you're much more integrated because you're in the same political struggle as your family and everyone you know, and you're fighting for your country. So actually, they were in a way, had more agency than the queer and anti-occupation people in Israel. But what was interesting is, of course, over all of this is the question of gay imperialism, which is a big topic right now, and what does that mean? And it's interpreted in a lot of ways. One way is this: if I go to Palestine and I assume and expect to meet queer people with a Western-style gay identity, then I am coming in with an imperialist impulse. However, I did meet people with a Western-style gay identity who are organizing in a Western way. Queer organizations that are activists, that do community work, that are in coalition, that have very Western gay and lesbian identities. So if I had come in there and assumed that no one there was going to be that way, that in a sense would have been the queer imperialism. If I had come in and said, oh, I can't come out in Palestine because it's all so different, then the queer people who were there would have lost the opportunity to connect with somebody around an identity that they already had. The particular issue about gay imperialism in Israel and Palestine is that Tel Aviv is a very tolerant and advanced place for queers. And Israel uses that to try to show how progressive they are. Because if you're American, yeah, that, you know, they need every soldier that they can get, so queer people serve openly in the army. But we, U.S. queers, think that if we're so used to gay being the least common denominator, the bottom line thing, that if gay people have rights somewhere, we equate that with the idea that it's a progressive society. This is no longer true. You know, so just because there's gay pride in Tel Aviv doesn't mean it's a progressive society. Or as a woman from the Palestinian lesbian organization in Haifa, Aswat, said, Israel's a selective democracy. It's a democracy for some people. You know, and we see this now in Holland, Netherlands as well, that they're using the fact that gay people are normal in Holland as a way to develop anti-Muslim attitudes. You know, so now we're not the cutting edge issue. You know, and we have to readjust to that. So that was really, really interesting. So then you have openly gay people in Palestine who are working for boycott. Now, so this is a nexus that completely justifies expansion of human rights to include gay people, as gay people all around the world are increasingly taking on similar constructions. Of course, they're culturally different. The experience of homophobia is different in each culture. The experience of gay identity is different. The strategy for how to respond to it is different. But the thing that is the same is that globally, heterosexual people believe that they are neutral, normal, objective-free, regular, and just the way things are. And that is a cross-cultural phenomena that creates problems in the lives of queer people everywhere, no matter how you define what queer is. So to me, that expansion exactly justifies what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard the gay imperialism before. Is that people are using?
Conversation now.
But so is it. I mean, there's also a discourse of human rights imperialism, right? Of the human rights project as a Western imperialist project, that you're bringing a certain conception of human rights, of rights-based orders and systems, and imposing them on societies that have very different systems of understanding relationships, of institutions, and political relationships, and so forth.
Right.
And how does that relate?
Well, it's complicated because you don't want to walk in somewhere and say, nobody here needs gay liberation, nobody here wants feminism. So if I say that, then I'm being an imperialist. Right, I think that's not operative anymore.
Why do you think it's operative?
Because gay liberation is being globalized like everything else. And you're seeing it in culturally specific expressions increasingly all over the world. Does anybody want to disagree with me? Because I'm willing to be challenged on this. Yes?
I would like to hear your view because it seems to me that this entire discussion is very much focused on homosexuality as an identity. And you just used the word gay liberation. And also with regard to your discourse on the human rights issue, what I find somewhat troubling is that the gay community tends to focus only on homosexuality as a pure thing, whereas thematically we're not speaking of homosexuality as something pure, but as a spectrum. And we somewhat taboo the issue of bisexuality and people who who change over time as well and who like to experiment. And I feel that I wonder whether there should be the next step of actually liberating sexual freedom as such rather than gay liberation. Because I think it actually alienates more people than liberating. And this is something that I'm missing in this conversation, that it seems to be forcing a choice for people. You either heterosexual or homosexual.
No, you're right.
I never use the word homosexuality, I only use the word queer. To encompass all forms of non-heteronormative engagement, whatever they may be. So, for me, I mean, no, but again, semantics for me is very important. Homosexuality is a huge red flag on the playing field. Like, it's not a term I use because it does, I think, presume a binary model. there's homosexuality and heterosexuality. It doesn't actually presume a wide array of activities, affiliations, subject positions, you know, and a wide array actually of gender, that not just boy and girl. Homosexuality, I think, still operates on the model that there are boys and there are girls. And for those of us who are interested in notions of queer, like all of that kind of binary stuff is just not, you know, that's not where we are at.
But I think I think something that we also have to recognize what we're up against as opposed to who we are. That when we talk about queer, and we refer to ourselves as queer, I use queer all the time too, and almost never say homosexual unless I'm talking about specifically about myself and my sexual desires, but I would hardly ever use myself to create a category of person, but for anyone else, that would be terrifying for everyone involved. And it seems to me, though, that we have to distinguish between the variations and the spectrum of our own identity and desire and so forth, which accommodates all sorts of stuff, right? Some of it is performative, some of it is sexual and sort of visceral and a whole range of other things. And so there can be all these different identities. But the way that people who discriminate against us and seek to impose violence on us and seek to contain us don't see those variations in the same way that we may see them internally and recognize that there is this incredible diversity within this community that we might call queer, that is global. And that we can self-identify in all these different ways, and then one day might self-identify one way, and another day self-identify some other way. And that's fine. We can acknowledge that and validate it, although I don't think we always do. But that we can continue to do that and work to a point where we can sort of honor each other's self-identifications, but also understand that we're up against, in the world, a standard of heteronormative sexuality and gender expression that is tyranny, that is not nuanced, not complex, not affirming of the diversity of human experience. That the whole point of hatred is that it creates very contained, easily discernible, discrete and often oppositional categories of identity and personhood that we can then say, okay, that's this kind of person, and this is what we're going to do to that kind of person, right? So that if there's a straight kid who reads male, but who is effeminate and gets the shit kicked out of him in school and is called a faggot, it doesn't matter that that kid's straight, right? What he's up against is something that is far more barbaric and Neanderthal than any kind of recognition of diversity that we might actually affirm. And so I think that for us to spend all of our time talking about all these different sort of ways of being queer, without also having a conversation recognizing that we're actually all up against this thing that is actually monolithic and sees us as such, I think is politically treacherous. Which is one of the things that I worry a little bit about when we in the Academy spend all this time talking about all the different identities and performativities and so forth. I think it's really important theoretically. But when you walk out into the world and you're a faggot or you're a dyke or you're a queer, the violence is coming at you no matter what you're self-identify on that given day. And the human rights crisis is actually their problem. They've created this by actually reducing us. So I think you're right to call us on any kind of reducing of categories, but I also think we have to understand that we live in a world that reduces us to categories.
But I don't think we can fight their categorization with our own. Like, I don't think we can fight their monolithic categorization with our own. I actually think, like, we have to fight hard against that. I mean, I think, again, maybe that also comes, again, out of my experience of sort of the relationship with second generation feminists insisting upon woman as a kind of identity, you know, that felt like a chokehold, you know, because but it is also a way of, shooting spitballs at power, and part of the way you do that is to refuse the identification that they want you to have. It's a strategy of refusal as opposed to affirmation, and that maybe is something that I come to.
I think you can
through
still
art,
do that, but also be very clear about what you're up against. I think you can do both of those things.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah.
I was kind of wanting to respond to what you just said, because I think that a lot of times what people, especially in the left, miss is that oppression is often a code, and oppression itself is often the code contained in the language of oppression. I think that that's like a dialectic that a lot of left people miss naturally because it's not obvious. But when you listen to people who are oppressive or who encourage oppression, they use the language of hate, or they use the language of anger or oppression. It's a very clear code. And I think that on the left, when language is used in a meaningful way with an understanding of what code can do, because language is so powerful, then that's when a lot of change happens. I think a lot of the civil rights movement, the language that's used, a lot of it actually is kind of ironic. The language of the civil rights movement was later, like in the late 70s and 80s, used against itself to oppress, right, in the media, to oppress the very people who rose up, in the environmental movement, the women's movement, and on and on. But the necessity for an understanding of a robust linguistic response, especially in the media, to the people who are considered the oppressors traditionally, like that's something that I just don't know why people don't get it. Just curious.
Well, I think it's hard to pay attention to the language that you use. And I think that language is about habit and pattern. And so we fall in, we are creatures of habit and pattern. And I think that language is, most people want the ideas to be relatively simple. So there's like this simple idea you could put forward on the table. We desire a society that tolerates homosexuals. I hear something like that, I feel like my skin is about to peel off my body. Because I think no, you do not. That is the very fucking the foundation of the oppression. I will not be tolerated by you. Right?
Exactly, that's the language.
Right, that is the language. So, but to unpack that language all the time, to use queer, to do LGBT, to go through the motions and to feel this sort of horror, left proliferation, it's a burden. And so, yeah, sometimes you don't want to do that, but I think you have to maintain a kind of rigor around the expansion of language, to expand the language to represent and enable our experience, right? But to guard against a kind of language that did emerge, I think when people were trying to break open the old prison house of language, a kind of language emerged that was notoriously opaque and notoriously difficult. And, but in the fancy-free moment, we didn't want to speak truth to power. Derrida didn't want to speak truth to power. What the fuck did he give a shit about speaking truth to power? He had other things he wanted to do with language. So now the question, it seems to me, is how to take all of the ideas that came out of that body of work, whether from Derrida to Judy Butler and back again, and to summon the enormous plasticity of language and to make it open and available to as many people as we possibly can. That is, if anything defines me, that's for me the struggle. Is how to insist on queer publicly?
Right, then how do we, speaking of public, then how do we, what constitutes victory in the realm of politics and policy, since we're here at the Kennedy School, where everything is reduced to, not the Kennedy School, but in politics and policy, everything has to be reduced to sound bites, to often binaries, to very easily digestible kinds of representations so that members of Congress who don't read, some who can't read very well, so that they'll actually be sympathetic to an experience which can't be reducible to precisely the linguistic constraints that you're fighting against. So how then, so does that mean that the only realm we can achieve any kind of victory in is the realm of culture? Right, that politics and policy is never going to, I mean this, I don't know, I mean I'm asking this question, one of the things that I've been sort of hammering about, sort of clamoring about, and whining about for a while, is the way that the movement has gotten stuck in a celebrity death match between court cases and ballot initiatives, mostly about marriage. And it seems to me that all social movements that seek and affect profound transformation on a societal level are social movements that do the kind of cultural work of changing hearts and minds, which is in the realm of art and visual representation and the various things, and education, the various things that we've devoted most of our lives or all of our lives to. But there's also that other work of the kind of political, policy, legal work of changing the laws so that our lives are a little bit more bearable in the places that we have to exist. And so I'm wondering, I mean, given what you just said, is the movement spending all of its time in a realm where there is no prospect for victory, precisely because
Yes.
our lives are, yeah.
Because when you've lost 31 out of 31 ballot measures, obviously it's not working.
Who's counting?
Right,
Right.
right. No, I think,
So what do you say to the folks here who would listen to what you just said, or what you just said, or what I just said, and they're like freaks? I mean, we know we're freaks, but you've given up half of the fight, they would say, or you've given up the most
No, it's just
important
simply
element.
practical that their strategy is not working. It's profoundly expensive and they're not making any progress. And it's because they're top-down bureaucratic organizations that don't have grassroots.
Okay.
And Human Rights Campaign is called Human Rights Campaign to not have words like gay or lesbian or queer in the title. Okay.
So it's an anti-human rights name.
Well,
no.
I remember when they started, there used to be Gay Community News in Boston, and they did a parody issue for April Fool's Day, and it was called Human Rights Community News. Yeah, it's kind of closeting. It's a closeting strategy. You wouldn't say no.
No, I mean, I don't think it's an anti-human rights strategy to call it the Human Rights Campaign. I mean, I think there's certain strategic benefits to that. I don't know what to say about your policy question, though, because I don't,
Because you see what I mean about language and policy, it has to be reduced and contained.
yes, but it's more reduced and more contained now than it ever has been before. And the marriage debate is certainly about that in many ways. Like it's decided that there's one word called marriage and that there's one idea of what a marriage is and what marriage is supposed to mean and what its role is in the culture. And, so there's no nuanced conversation at all about the history of marriage, for instance. Like there's no one doing teach-ins or sit-ins about like what the history of marriage is. Very, very different than, this sort of like those two plastic people on top of the cake model that we have operating right now. But I feel very, very pessimistic politically. Like I don't think a lot of political change is possible. I think if you have, we live basically in a third world country that has completely abandoned its public education system. You cannot have demonstrative political forward movement without an educated public. Do you know what I mean? So you can't, like, how could we have any kind of nuanced conversation? You're right, most of our Congress people don't know how to read.
When I say they don't read, I mean that they have a very small window of opportunity. I mean, anybody you talk to who works on the Hill for any of these folks knows that they have literally like an hour and a half to read anything, which is why right? They read
Right.
distillations of the bills, 3-point bullet points, right? And what we teach at Penny School in many ways is to reduce it to triplicate, right? You get a 3 point. I teach at my communications course, right? You gotta get it down to 3 points.
Right.
And
See, what we teach in
maybe
the,
I'm part of the problem.
over in the art department, we teach like 3 points, that's a failing grade. You only got 3 points? I would like to see 16 simultaneous contradictory quotes. That's what I'm after, because that's
Which is
my...
why Dr. Molesworth is never going to Washington.
No, I am never going to Washington, and I've made it very clear to all of the people who think I should go that I am not their girl. No, seriously though, I mean, I think that is what great art does, right? It refuses the 3 bullet points. It refuses the simplification of our experience. You know, it expands upon it. It insists over and again upon its ultimate difficulty, on its untranslatability, perhaps even its unexpressibility. That's the game. You know, I'm after. Like, I'm not after. And that's why I'm not, in fact, like, I'm not an activist. Like, every benefit won for me by an activist, I make immediate use of to be counted, like it's a census. That's my, but the other stuff, no.
But you are, so
Yes,
respond to that.
Sarah is.
I'm just very, very optimistic, I'm a very optimistic person. I've experienced profound social transformation in my own lifetime. I've seen it achieved by regular people. I know that regular people can change the world, and they do it almost every 30 years, periodically, and this isn't the moment, but it's coming, and I'm excited and waiting for it.
I think you look more pessimistic than I do. Like,
You perform pessimism but embody optimism,
That's right.
and you embody optimism but perform
Oh
pessimism.
no, I think that shit is broken. Broke.
And I'm like Whitman, I contain multitudes. Always have, if you're at a gay event, you have to invoke Whitman, or at least other
But
questions.
other questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm not sure quite how to say this, but I'm going to try. It's a question really for both of you, but Sarah, I wanted you to talk more, especially. I feel like there's this conversation going on that is a lot about identity politics, right? And then there's debates within that. Should it be, how should we define queer, or how should we define homosexuality? I feel like you said something really important when you were talking about your trip and about what, I haven't actually heard that word answer, listened for either, but that idea that you go in and you assume, what's the issue and what is the issue mean? For me, we all speak very often from our own experience of what have been the quintessential issues, what have places we feel slighted or that we feel, misseen, unseen, and diminished by. But it seems so important to get beyond that, and I know you do that in your work, and I'm only asking Sarah because I know that Sarah's work more than yours, but I'd love for you both to speak, all three to speak to this, that some broader vision of humanity, there are so many ways that there are connections between different identities. So the kid who's in school and learning disabled and treated badly for that is not actually that different than the gay person who's treated badly for that. Not actually that different, from my point of view, from people who are poor and totally unrecognized in the struggles that they have by people who have lots of money and don't know anything about it. And I feel like if we don't start to cut across this identity politics, we're pretty much lost. I'm not speaking about policy issues because it isn't a reductive thing like the 3-point bulletin. It is much broader, much more complex, but really opening out. And I guess I really want to hear you guys speak more about that, because Sarah, I know you do that in your work all the time and still maintain some sense of...
Full disclosure, we went to high school together. An all-girls public high school, which doesn't exist anymore.
Sweetwood's Robin, so it's not.
Oh, yeah, she went there too. Annalena Kagan went to high school with us also, actually. Anyway, to answer that, in my experience, although I do hold a broad view, I have personally experienced that queer people are often the problematic person. The problematic link, the people that nobody wants to be in coalition with, for example. That is changing now, I think. I mean, in the United States of America, a Palestinian has less of a human face in the American conversation than a queer person. So this, who is the weak link person that needs to be defended is shifting. But I've always focused on queers because those are the people that nobody else cared about. So while theoretically I do understand what you're saying, it's not always reciprocal recognition. And as soon as the reciprocity isn't there, then for me, anyway, my impulse is to go to bat for the people who are the most vulnerable and who I identify with.
So I totally disagree, but your work, I think your work is very class-conscious. Very often, you're looking at other forms of deprivation and forms of oppression, and you speak to those issues. And it's interesting that you maintain what you just said now, and that you maintain a sense that it's important to speak to the issues of sexuality. But I agree that you say
Well, I'm glad that you say that, but I don't think that other people can hear the other content because the queer stuff is the thing that they hear and see. And that becomes the grounds for exclusion and diminishment and all of that. So if you stop talking about that, then you can be included in other kinds of conversation, but I don't want to be included in those conversations at that price.
Yeah, right. I mean, you've written over and over again. Here you're talking about this. I love the fact that you are constantly hammering away at this point that lesbian writers are excluded, lesbian stories are excluded, lesbian playwrights are excluded. And the way that you insist on, I think you're right, insist on this complexity in terms of the representation. You cut across all these different experiences to represent, I think, a fuller and richer humanity, which is itself kind of divided, but yet at the same time you insist, I'm not going to give up that piece of myself in order to gain entrance, because it's that piece of myself that has actually
Is the problem. Right.
Right, and you navigate that, I think, I think we all do. I think we all do in different ways, but I think you're very explicit about how you navigate.
Well, we've all decided to have queer content in what we do, and that's a very precise choice. Yeah.
Yeah, we all don't know where to come with somebody.
I guess I don't have any question for, well, I have a question for Sarah, but another broader question about dead cripples activism in some ways. In this society, how I often wonder how in the sort of culture of debt that we have, how much debt really people up or becoming more activist. That's
The culture of debt.
yeah, I feel like we're just a huge culture of debt. I feel like in some ways it.
I don't see any what you see. If somebody can just contradict me.
Yeah, it just really drains people's capacity.
And the people who built the union movement were working 80 hours a week. I mean, the most radical movements are built by people who have no free time and no leisure time. So I don't really.
I don't know. I have a. No, I don't know. A feeling of indebtedness that people have today.
Do you think it keeps people from
Just some expression. But my other question is actually for Helen.
Maybe it gets back to your point about the world consumers and that the debt comes from our overconsumption, and therefore we're disempowered by the fact that we become consumers and that we're no longer producers, and that debt is accumulated through this kind of identity of consumption. What?
And privatization.
And privatization, right.
So much of what I think of as gay politics, the social part, and I thought one of the things that your exhibition really sort of did brilliantly was it sort of presented this sort of momentary confluence of the political and the aesthetic, and social and all these forces. And one of the things that I always sort of worry about, especially with regards to camp, so much of it was this sort of coding that was, very sort of political in nature. What happens, when, aesthetic movements burn out, and they become cliche. So, do you think that, do you foresee the queer gay movement regenerating itself aesthetically?
Well, I think it's going to be really different. And I think, I don't know how many of you follow contemporary art, but there's this young artist now, Rghts. And he is whacked out. And he's actually the first artist that really made me feel like, oh, okay, there's now going to be art made by people who are are so much younger than I am
We all know.
that I will not understand it.
Why my
And it is not for me.
uh,
I am not the audience
my book was
for
just
Ryan
first-
Trecarton. But one of my favorite Ryan Trecarton moments, and the movie's like deeply queer, but it has no camp.
And I want her to be able to.
And there's this great moment, it's really performative, and he's in drag, but drag is a word that I use to describe what's happening. But it isn't, because drag's like, I might as well be talking on like a landline telephone. You know what I mean? It's like, I like, might as well go to the bank to take out money from a teller, right? Like, it's a way of talking, but that is totally dated. But there is this great moment, and he does videos and performances, and he emerges in front of the camera at one point and says, there are so many subject positions. I just don't want any of them. And like, for me, that's actually, like,
Who was young and.
it goes to a lot of these conversations. Like, for me, the struggle was like, there are so many subject positions, and I'm gonna claim like a handful of them, and they're gonna be in contradiction with one another, and that's gonna make me a radical subject. But there's this other thing happening now, like, there's so many subject positions, I don't want any of them. And it's good, it's not like that because they're not good enough, it's like the whole concept doesn't even appeal. And so, yes, I think he may be our first queer artist without camp of any kind. And it's wild. I don't know how to talk about the world. But, so yes, I do think like certain aesthetic formations that were born of the oppression and were strategies of identification and avoidance of the oppression will devolve and become only the stuff of like TV sitcom, you know, in a kind of hackneyed way, and something else will emerge.
When I'm talking about those, it's usually conditions. They are extremely.
Time for one more question.
And I think they are selected pinpoint.
I'll give you the final word. No, I don't want you to say final thoughts.
What are you working on, Helen?
I am working on an exhibition of art of the 1980s. And an Amy Schulman retrospective. So I continue to do my queer thing in the art world. What are you working on?
I, blah, 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 blah. You know, I wrote this movie with Cheryl Dunier called The Owls. I went to Berlin. And we're now writing two other movies. One is about Africans in Amsterdam. And she's Liberian, she lives in Amsterdam. And the other is a porn movie. And the question for the porn movie was, what is the last lesbian taboo? What is the last lesbian taboo?
What is it?
Anybody?
I don't know.
Mommy. The movie's called Mommy is Coming.
Wait, I don't get it. I'm such a poor lesbian, I don't get that. What's
Eroticizing your mother.
like wanting to do it with your mother?
Annie Sprinkle is playing Mommy. And there's some stripper from Berlin, I guess, or somebody who's playing the daughter.
And then they have
My life is so boring. Wow. What did you say?
do you think that's more taboo than father-daughter? Father-son?
Mommy, daughter is the last taboo.
Very fast. 25 years of doing the combo.
That's no dig today.
Well, on that note, that's an interesting conclusion to the activist studio. Love with mom. All right, thank you very much, Sarah and Helen.